And thank you to Karen for, oh,
I got
all
it.
right, we got it. Perfect. All right, so thank you all for being here this afternoon. I really appreciate it. As Karen mentioned, I am currently the vice president of our union, and I also am an associate professor of management in the School of Business. I do research in the area broadly of employee stress and well-being. One of my focus areas is on workplace mistreatment. So that includes things like bullying and harassment, which I'm going to focus on today. I also teach courses on organizational behavior, human resources, and work and stress. So I spend a lot of time talking to my students about these topics as well. So my goal for today is really to blend the research expertise that I bring to this topic, as well as my knowledge of our union resources and Oakland's policies on these topics to help better inform our membership of what bullying is, what your protections are around this topic, and resources available to you. So these are the points that I'm planning to hit in our time together. My goal is to not spend this entire time talking. So my presentation should take about 40 minutes, and then you'll have time for discussion and questions at the end. That being said, if you do have questions throughout, please feel free to let me know. We have some options for participation, which I am going to actually jump right over to as well. Because I, again, don't want this to just be me talking to you the whole time. I want to make sure that you're getting out of this what you're looking for. We're answering all the questions that we can, and that this time is valuable to you. So given the nature of the topic, this can be a kind of sensitive topic, especially if you're someone who has experienced or faced workplace bullying or harassment. And given that we're recording this session, I wanted to provide an alternative way of participating today. And there'll be a few different points at which I'll be actively asking for your participation and your input. If you'd like to use your phone to scan the QR code or hop on another tab in your browser and go to slido.com, you can put this code in. The default for this is anonymous, so you'll be submitting responses or questions without your name attached to it. You can put your name on it if you'd like to. You do not have to. If this is too much for you, you're not interested in participating this way, that's totally fine. You're not going to miss anything. And this information will pop up on the slides where we're using it. So if you choose later on to participate, you can still grab this information. So as we're going through, there'll be a couple of points at which I ask you to go to this page and give a response to a question I'll pose. There's also going to be an option on that slide for questions and answers. So if you have a question throughout the presentation that you want addressed, feel free to put it in there. Again, if you don't want to use it, we can use the chat, or you can unmute yourself. You can also send me a direct message. I have the chat up here so that I can see your communications as well. So moving right into the first piece of this, I want to help us better understand what workplace bullying and harassment is, what leads to these behaviors in the workplace, and what are some of the outcomes associated with this behavior. So I like to start off my presentations with some statistics, some personal relevance of why this should be important to people. When we look at the research on bullying and harassment, there are a number of studies that try to estimate prevalence rates. So how common is this behavior? Looking particularly at studies that have been done in US populations of employees, we see these prevalence rates range anywhere from 8 to 18%. These vary depending on how we're measuring bullying, what industry or occupation we're looking at, a variety of different aspects. So 8 is on the low, 18 is on the high end of what we see, but this varies study to study. And this typically is measured over the last 12 months, although not always. So I just asked some of you to, or asked you all to log into Slido. And this first question that I'm going to open to us before I share the textbook research definition of what workplace bullying and harassment are, I want to hear from you all. How would you describe workplace bullying? Or when you think of this term, what comes to mind? This can be a word, a phrase, a sentence, however you'd like to respond. You should also be able to respond multiple times if you have more than one thing that comes to mind. So as this word cloud is populating, as people are responding, I'm already seeing some common themes pop up, many of which are actually part of how we would define and describe workplace bullying and harassment. So things like threats and intimidation, undermining colleagues constantly. This intimidation is coming up a few different times. Use of power to oppress. Power is a really key piece of the puzzle when we think about bullying and harassment. There's usually, but not always, a power differential involved. And this might be formal power, but it doesn't have to be. I also see, and I'll move on in just a moment, but I'll talk about this as well, this idea of whether it's a once-off behavior or continued. So is it a pattern of behavior, or is it just someone engaging in a one-off negative behavior? So thank you all for sharing these. It sounds like we have a pretty solid shared understanding of what this concept is. And so I want to go a little bit farther and really define it for us and unpack what this is getting at and what it means. So when we look at workplace bullying, what we tend to ascribe the label of bullying to is a situation where someone is repeatedly and over time exposed to negative acts. And these can be coming from coworkers, supervisors, or subordinates. And another key piece of this is that the person, so we tend to use the language of either victim or target, the person on the receiving end of these behaviors, have difficulty defending themselves against the mistreatment. They may feel powerless or very isolated, like they're unable to do anything about the behavior. Harassment, when we look at that particular definition, it includes similar phrases, things like repeated and persistent negative acts that typically are occurring over 6 months or longer. Now, we think of these as being repeated and over time behaviors. This is not at all by any means to say that if someone engages in a one-off behavior that is negative, threatening, intimidating, hostile, that's not problematic or not worthy of being elevated to some of these policies we'll talk about later. But when we think about putting things really in the bucket of bullying or harassment, typically it is a repeated over time behavior. Now, you might be wondering what we mean when we say negative acts. That's a pretty broad term. It's going to be different also depending on who you ask what a negative act is or what someone perceives as a negative act. We can look at the way this is measured in the literature, and we see things being captured like being humiliated or ridiculed in connection to your work. If you are the subject of excessive teasing or sarcasm, having your opinions ignored. It can also be directly related to the work that you're being assigned. So perhaps being given work that has unreasonable deadlines associated with it, or being excessively monitored in terms of your work output. It can include intimidating behavior, like you mentioned, some of you mentioned on the last slide, like threats, shouting, finger pointing, blocking your way, things like that. There are other terms that are used under this umbrella, things like mobbing, psychological violence. I'm going to stick with these two for the purpose of today. Another small point that I will mention, we are using this term like bullying and harassment. Why both? What is the difference? They tend to refer to the same types of behaviors. We tend to use or defer to the term harassment when it is specific to a protected category, something like race or sex. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into OU's policies, but I just wanted to bring that up now to kind of key you into a little bit of the distinction there. So when we think about bullying and harassment, it's really important that we understand what leads to these behaviors. Why are they happening in the first place? Because this helps us understand how we can prevent them. Typically, when we're thinking about predictors of bullying and harassment, we can categorize them as either being situational, so something about the work conditions itself, the organization, or we can think about them as being individual predictors. And this bucket, we can actually break down further. We can think about them as characteristics of the perpetrator, the person doing the bullying, or characteristics of the victim or target, the person being bullied. I'm not going to go into each of these in a high level of detail just for the sake of time today, but the situational predictors that we look at, a lot of them are work stressors, things that are increasing pressure on employees to perform, like having high levels of work assigned to them, rollover load, for example, having work constraints, like a lot of red tape or bureaucracy that you need to work through, having insecure employment. We also see, environments that have a lot of interpersonal conflict are things that lead to these more elevated, severe behaviors of bullying and harassment. On the individual side, when we look at characteristics of people who either engage in or are on the receiving end of these behaviors, it may or may not, depending on your experience with this, surprise you to know or to find out that sometimes we see these characteristics overlapping. So perpetrators and targets actually share some of these characteristics. We know that people who have previously been victims of bullying are more likely to engage in that behavior. Perpetrators also tend to have higher levels of things like narcissism, trait, anger, and disagreeableness. We tend to see men engaging in more bullying behavior, but this also varies depending on the occupational context we're looking at. So that's kind of a broad statement about that. When we look at targets or victims of bullying and harassment, again, there are some similarities. We tend to see victims having higher levels of negative affect, so they tend to experience higher levels of negative emotion. These last two I've italicized are actually specific to victims. There's actually some research suggesting that employees with higher levels of conscientiousness and cognitive ability are targeted as victims of bullying. And some of the thoughts around this is that it might be coworkers kind of bullying them into lowering the bar of their performance. So basically bullying high performers into kind of coming into line with the rest of the work group. So these are some predictors I wanted to highlight. I also always try to be really careful when I talk about target predictors of bullying and harassment, that I never want to veer into victim blaming, but it is important for us to understand all of the parties involved in this interaction, since it isn't occurring in a vacuum. It's a relationship within a larger organizational context. Okay. Now, I'm guessing that most, if not all of you, signed on to today's workshop because you know that bullying and harassment is a problem. You know that it leads to negative outcomes. So this particular slide might be a little bit of preaching to the choir in terms of what these negative outcomes are. However, if you need further convincing of why this is an issue, I've included this here for us to kind of look at and think about for a moment. So we know that people who experience bullying and harassment have a number of negative outcomes. Negative in terms of their health. So we see decreases in mental health outcomes like anxiety and depression, or just say decreased mental health with increases in anxiety and depression, increased burnout, even increased reports of post-traumatic stress symptoms. So this is really severe and people carry it with them for quite a long time. We also see negative outcomes in terms of work performance. So this is important for the individual, also for the organization. We know that people take this home with them. So it affects their families, it affects their coworkers as well. There's research showing that people who just observe this type of behavior in the workplace also have negative outcomes. So it's not just the victim or the target that is affected here as well. Okay, so now that we have a little bit of background in terms of what bullying and harassment is, what leads to it, what are some outcomes associated with it, this next participation piece I have is, I'm curious to know from our audience if any of you have experienced this, and I'll leave it open in terms of time frame. This could be really at any point. And you can respond with multiple pieces. So if you've been a victim and you've seen it happen to others, or you haven't experienced but you've seen it happen to others, you can click whichever apply to you. So I know only a portion of our participants logged on right now are actually responding to this. So I don't want to extrapolate to everyone that's on here or our whole organization, but it is surprising to me even just seeing this small sample of people who are saying that they've either seen it or had it happen to them, not as many saying no. I'm guessing also there's a little bit of self-selection in here. If you're somebody who's seen it happen or been a victim of it, you're probably more likely to scan that QR code and put your response in. So thank you for sharing this. And I'm sorry for those of you that have experienced this and have seen it happen to others. So given that we know the negative outcomes of this behavior, and also unfortunately that we've seen our members experiencing it either here or elsewhere, the really kind of key important piece of this that I want us to take away is, what can we do about it, either directly, indirectly, or through the channels that we have through Oakland and through our union. So that's what the second piece of this presentation is going to be aimed at addressing. Now, before I do that, I am going to highlight a quote that I came across while preparing for this workshop. And I share this not at all to be defeatist, but just to really acknowledge the state of where we're at in terms of what we know about preventing workplace bullying. This quote is from two of the top researchers in this field when they were reviewing the intervention literature in this area just a couple of years ago, and really highlighting that we seem to be better at actually helping victims or targets of bullying overcome those negative outcomes of bullying than we are at preventing bullying from happening in the first place. So again, I bring this up not to be defeatist, but just to acknowledge the difficulty of 100% preventing this behavior in the first place. Not to say that it can't be done, and I'm going to share a number of things that hopefully will go a long way in helping to address this. So when we think about what we can do about workplace bullying and harassment, we can approach it from several different angles. Now, we can think about it as the target. If this is happening to me, what do I do? What are my potential courses of action here? And you have several, and it's going to be very specific to the situation, to what you're comfortable with, whether you feel physically safe, emotionally safe, so on and so forth. So when we think about this, you can address it directly. You can go to the person who engaged in that bullying behavior and try to have a conversation with them. I could spend a much longer time talking just about this piece. We can come back to it if people are interested, but that is an option. It can be very difficult. We could go to a supervisor. So for us, that might be a department chair, a dean, someone in the administration, perhaps ours or the person who's bullying us, supervisor, if they're different people. This kind of circumvents that, having a conversation with the bully. One piece I always tell my students is whenever we're talking about harassment, and I always want to bring up and note too, is the importance of documenting the behavior, the interaction, what actually happened. We know with the way most of us are working these days, a lot of communication is happening electronically, whether it's an email, a text message, a voicemail. So if the bullying is coming that way, save it. If it's something that happened in person or that was over the phone, not recorded, write it down. Write yourself a note, send yourself an email, something to have the details noted of what happened in that particular situation. Also, I want to encourage people to reach out for support. That might be to a colleague, a mentor, us in the union, as I'm going to reiterate several more times. Your family members or friends, reaching out for support with this is really important as well, because again, it can feel so isolating. If we are in a position either as a supervisor, so when I say supervisor here, might be again, department chairs, area leads, things like that, or even coworkers that feel like we have the power to change something about this. We all have a role in the cultural norms that we're developing and enforcing in our areas and our departments and our units. And we have responsibility for role modeling the behaviors that we want to see other people engaging in, and also giving feedback when people are engaging in some of these destructive, hurtful interactions in the workplace. That might be informal feedback, it might be formal feedback if we're in the process of giving some performance feedback to a colleague or to a person in our department. I also want to just briefly talk a little bit about what we know about bystander interventions. So bystanders or observers, these are people who witnessed the bullying happening. If you can imagine, you're in a department meeting and you see someone engaging in bullying behavior, or in the lunchroom or somewhere else on campus, or in a university event or setting, and this is happening, what can you do? Now, unfortunately, a lot of the times the initial response is to just do nothing or say nothing, or to go and talk to someone else about it afterwards. This is not necessarily, as you can imagine, always the most effective, and it actually is fairly ineffective and can tacitly approve or show approval of that bullying behavior if no one else is saying anything to stop it or address it. We can think about these intervention behaviors as being active or passive, and also constructive versus destructive. So some of those more active, constructive behaviors would be to directly intervene in the behavior, either directly calling out the perpetrator, telling them to stop whatever the behavior they're engaging in, or providing support for the victim, either in the moment or afterwards. We really want to try to avoid that doing nothing or re-victimizing the target by joining in on the bullying or following up and joining in on it later on. Another suggestion I like to offer here too, oftentimes when people are thinking about whether they're going to intervene, they're thinking about what the risks are to themselves in intervening. What's the risk of me saying something? People who intervene are more likely to think first, what is the risk of me not saying something? What is likely to happen if I don't speak up and stop this behavior or intervene? And that tends to be associated with more of these intervention behaviors. And we do tend to see positive effects of intervening in this bullying behavior. Now, I'm going to just touch on this briefly, given, I'm aware of my audience and not all of us may feel like we're in a position to affect some of these changes, but given that it is not just an individual issue, but also an organizational issue as well, it needs to be addressed with organizational solutions. So this is by no means exhaustive, but some of the things we know are actually effective for reducing bullying and harassment in workplaces. So I listed some workplace stressors that are associated with bullying, doing things to actually address and reduce those workplace demands, help lead to lower levels of bullying. Even promoting awareness of the topic like we're doing today leads to lower reports of bullying. And then there are different trainings that we can do and interventions to actually train people on conflict management or to develop a better civility climate as well. And the other piece we're going to talk about today are these policies that we can institute and enforce as well. Okay. Now, before I shift over to the policy piece of this discussion, I did want to take a moment to highlight a kind of a related issue is the question of, what if the perpetrator is a student? Now, it is not unheard of for a faculty member to say or experience, I'm being bullied by a student or a group of students, perhaps. What do we do then? I will include some direct contact information in just a few minutes, but OU policies still apply to student behavior. You should still take action either directly or through these channels that we're talking about today. The Dean of Students office would be your direct line there of who you would go to report concerning student behavior. I also want to highlight too, we have the Behavioral Concerns Committee. There is a link at the very top of the OU landing page that says report behavior. So if you have something that's happening with a student that is concerning to you, related to bullying and harassment, you can go and use that form and it will route to the Dean of Students office, to campus police, and to this Behavioral Concerns Committee so that they have that information and can follow up. And, in thinking about this and talking to, Amy about this as well, we really want people to use the channels of reporting this behavior rather than assuming that someone else is going to make that report for you, because sometimes that doesn't happen and we don't know about it, or the university doesn't know about it, and the concern goes unheard. Okay, so moving into talking specifically about those policies that are available to you, the other resources that are available on campus. We're going to shift into this with my last participation piece before our Q&A, but I am curious from our audience how familiar you all are with Oakland's workplace bullying policy. Okay, so it looks like the responses are a little bit split along our group. I will say I'm not terribly surprised by this. Again, I think a lot of people probably self-selected, excuse me, into this workshop to learn more about this topic. So it doesn't surprise me that the responses are largely in that somewhat or not at all category. Also, this is a fairly new policy that Oakland has. It was implemented in 2016, so it's actually not, hasn't been around for that long. Excuse me. Now, I know talking about policies and procedures can get very dry very quickly, so I am not going to read off all of these policies to you and go through these in a high level of detail. Amy and I were talking before this, and we are going to send out some resources along with this presentation to our membership afterwards so that you have direct access to this. And if you want to jot them down or take a screenshot or photo, you're more than welcome to as well. I just want to point out some high level pieces of information that are going to be relevant to you if you are experiencing or even witnessing bullying and harassment. Now, the first three policies I've listed here, 7, 10, 11, and 12, are really specific to discrimination complaints and equal employment opportunity. So this connects back to my earlier point about that distinction between bullying and harassment. Discrimination complaints arise when someone is being targeted because of a protected class or category. Title VII has a small set of them. Oakland's policy is actually much broader. I'm just going to read them off really quickly because I think a lot of people probably aren't aware of all of these protected categories, but they include race, sex, sexual orientation, age, height, weight, disability, color, religion, creed, national origin or ancestry, marital status, familial status, or veteran status. It also provides protection for anyone reporting discrimination or participating in an investigation around discrimination from retaliation. So you shouldn't be, punished or harmed because you made that report or because you participated with the investigation. The 7-11 policy has pretty detailed procedures in it in terms of how these complaint processes are handled. There is language in this policy that you need to report the behavior or the most recent incident of behavior within 60 days of it happening. So there is a time clock associated with this policy. I will point out that there is a caveat in there that Oakland reserves the right to investigate things that go beyond that 60 days. So it's not just a blanket. If it's beyond 60 days, this isn't available. Definitely still follow up on it. Another important piece that relates to union resources available to you all, you have the right with these policies to have a support person present with you throughout the investigation process. So that could be a union representative. The policy says that it cannot be an attorney, but it can be a support person, which a person from the union would be a great person to accompany you. You can also, if it's related to our contract, file a grievance rather than going the route of a discrimination complaint. The last one I want to just talk about a little bit more, and I'm gonna route us into our discussion just to keeping an eye on the time and knowing where everybody is today. So when we look at this workplace bullying policy, again, this is fairly recent from 2016. It is much briefer than the discrimination policies. This is language, some of the language used in this policy. So we see similar descriptions of bullying as I provided at the beginning of our presentation. Some things to note about this. Again, this can happen in person over different forms of technology, email, text message, voice communications. The policy uses the word intentionally a couple of times, which I'm not going to get into the weeds about, but isn't necessarily a part of how we would measure bullying, but it is in there. I wouldn't let that stop you from following up on this if you are going to make a complaint under this policy. Now, what do we do with this information? If you experience bullying and harassment, you see it, you want to report it, these are resources available to you. So if you are reporting under that workplace bullying policy, your route would be through OU Human Resources, and Joy Cunningham is our VP of HR. This is her contact information. You can reach out directly to her. If you are going through one of the policies specific to discrimination, if it's a student engaging in that behavior, your route is going to be with Michael Wadsworth in the Dean of Students office. If it is a staff member, an employee, another faculty member, that would be through the DE&I office. So Chad Martinez would be your contact there. If it's an immediate threat, I'm including the campus police information here as well if you needed to go that route. Okay. Keeping this, again, somewhat brief considering our time, there are a few pieces of our faculty contract that are relevant to this topic. So the first of which is our discipline and discharge article, and I have it linked in with page numbers here if you want to refer to it later on. This is relevant whether you are the person making the complaint or if you happen to be the person that the complaint is being made about. This lays out what your rights are through that process, through the investigation of having the right to be represented, what would happen throughout that procedure. The grievance process also may be relevant here as well, depending on the particular type of behavior that is occurring and the situation. We do want to remind people that we cannot grieve other members of our bargaining unit. So that means you can't file a grievance against a colleague who's a union member or your department chair. That being said, the behavior might still be relevant to some of the other policies that I just mentioned. So it is something that might, under certain situations, be relevant that we want to be aware of. I'm providing several important union contacts here as well. I'll share my information at the end here in just a moment as well. If you are in doubt, you're experiencing bullying or harassment, reach out to us as the union. We are here to support our members as a resource. Even if you're not sure if it's a contract issue or you know that it's not, we are still here to help you navigate through that process. Amy Pollard, our executive director, can meet with you confidentially, so you can talk to her and she can help you identify your potential routes to go with your situation, and you can decide how to proceed from there. I've included our president Karen's contact information here, as well as Jennifer Thor, our grievance officer as well, and you can reach out to any of us on the executive committee for help with your situation. Here's my information as well. I just want to, again, thank you all so much for taking the time to be here this afternoon. And I want to just also put in a plug. This is related to the topic, somewhat tangentially, although not entirely. We did release our workplace satisfaction survey at the beginning of the week. Amy sent that out to all of our members' emails. If you haven't already taken it, please take a few minutes to do so. It's really important to us for us to know what issues our members are facing so that we can address them. Similar with this bullying and harassment topic, we want to know if our members are facing these issues so that we can help them address them. And also so we know if these policies aren't working effectively so that we can take steps to remedy that. Okay, so I have a few questions here already. So I kind of expected some of these questions to come up, and I'm actually going, let me see if I can stop sharing. All right. Can you all still hear me okay? All right. So I am going to pull up those slides so that I can see. I stopped sharing and my slides just disappeared. Okay, so I can still see the questions on my end, so I'm going to address a couple of them. And if people want to raise their hand or put anything in the chat, you're more than welcome to do that too. I'm keeping an eye on everything. Let's see. So a quick question I can answer. Someone asked about universities, if other universities have included tenure status as a protected category in terms of who is protected from bullying, because again, we know that power differential is really relevant in bullying cases. I am not aware of tenure being included in these policies. I know Amy did some digging to compare our policy to other universities. I don't know if Amy came across that at all.
I've never seen that at all.
Yeah, I don't think that it is likely to be included because you should be protected regardless, although it's definitely a barrier to coming forward. And that retaliation protection piece also definitely relevant here as well. But it's a reason why people don't necessarily report. So definitely an issue. Another question that I've seen getting some likes and upvotes here is how to protect yourself in a department culture where there's a small group of bullies who support each other and thereby reinforce the bullying behavior. So this is definitely something we see where there's actually a culture where this is okay and allowed. This is really difficult. So depending on who is involved in the situation, if there is a way for you to directly address it, you can take the approach of trying to address it. And typically when we think about those difficult conversations, there needs to be practice that goes into this, but it's also really helpful to separate the intentions from the behavior. So not necessarily assuming the intent behind the behavior, but really outlining this is the impact that it's having on me, on my performance, on our department or our unit, perhaps. Depending on who is involved, perhaps seeking support and aligning yourself with other people with power in the area, either other more senior or tenured folks, your department chair. That can also be a protective way of supporting yourself. There's also, recommendations if you don't feel safe, in addressing all of these issues, or, you don't want to completely leave your job, to minimize the contact that you have with the people that are engaging in the bullying. So keeping your interactions brief, focused on information, staying friendly on your side, and also firm in your interactions. Those are helpful if you can't necessarily directly address it, but need to continue interacting with these individuals.
Can I offer one more there?
Yeah.
One that I've seen in certain departments where these kinds of issues happen is a lack of transparency in department policies and a lack of policies in department policies. So having really clear and really transparent policies about how does the department work, what are expectations, how does this procedure work, how does this procedure work, and having that all transparent where everyone can see it, I think really helps.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. And I think that does really highlight, that's an important point of having clear policies and expectations of this is the behavior we expect of one another. This is what's going to happen if we don't see that happening. There's also another question that I don't necessarily have a specific OU response to, but a question about how you would deal with bullying and or harassment that comes from external OU parties during OU activities. So either like events or committee work. Amy, I'm not sure. I can't think of off the top of my head. I think that there is some coverage in the discrimination policies if it is like a vendor that you're working with, a consultant, but this sounds like it's outside OU individuals. I would still make OU aware of that behavior, whether it's your department chair, whoever is overseeing the event that you're taking part in, so that they know that the person that we're interacting with or working with is engaging in these behaviors. It also might be, again, addressing it directly or trying to remove your involvement with them in the future if you have direct power over that.
If it's something you're doing in the course of your job at Oakland University still has a responsibility to protect you.
Yeah.
So they might not be able to take action against the external body, but they should be able to create a level of protection. But it's ultimately their responsibility as the employer.
Yeah, and I do see Ken's point in the chat too, that about recommending using the behavior concerns report on the OU police website, because that definitely gets routed directly to the police, because there have been some issues in the past with behaviors not getting dealt with. I have another question in the chat, which I think is really insightful and important, and we could spend a whole nother hour just talking on, are the issue of microaggressions and how they might be used to thwart shared governance. Microaggressions are another category of behaviors. They are uncivil behaviors that the intent can be ambiguous. So we're not necessarily directly able to say like, yes, that person's being uncivil or rude or bullying me. It actually has been termed kind of a new form of discrimination, because we see underrepresented individuals experiencing them more often. I think that it is something that can definitely be used to undermine people's influence. It's certainly harmful. We see some of the same negative effects that I outlined of bullying and harassment with lower levels of these behaviors like incivility and microaggressions. So definitely relevant to the topic we've been talking about. I'm happy to talk to more directly about that as well. I want to be sensitive again of everybody's time, and I know that some of you may be hopping on to other meetings or needing to get to the rest of your afternoon. Thank you all again so much for taking the time. I hope that this has been helpful. Again, I just want to reiterate, we are here to support you and as a resource. So if there is anything that we as the union can do, please do not hesitate to reach out. And I'm happy to stay on and chat if people have questions as well, but thank you. And Karen and Amy, if you have anything, I'll turn it back over to you.
I just had one final one, just in terms of thinking about microaggressions in specific, but generally speaking, shining a light on these issues is probably one of the most important things, so that they get seen, and you can't not pay attention. You have to pay attention to them. And I'm happy to do that. If faculty members don't want to do it themselves, if there's ways that things can be handled outside of that faculty member, if I need to be a squeaky wheel, if I need to reach out, I'm completely happy to do that. And sometimes I can do it in a completely anonymous fashion. Sometimes I can just serve as an intermediary. But I think the more we sort of draw attention to it, I think that can be very helpful.
And if I can just amplify what Amy just said, that if there are problems, we may not be able to immediately resolve them. We may not be able to resolve a particular problem, but we certainly need to know about these problems so that we can think about longer term strategies in terms of how to prevent them in the future. And certainly we would like them not to happen at all. And so the more we understand what's going on, the better we can serve the members and make Oakland have a better workplace. That's our primary goal here. And I would also like to just take this opportunity. I know Caitlin has offered to stay on a little bit longer for folks, but I would like to spend a moment to thank her for this lovely overview and set of suggestions for how to intervene and how to think about this problem. This is something that we certainly do not have what I would call a good climate at Oakland. And anything that we can do to make the climate better is a good thing. And I am very grateful that you have given us such a concise and thorough set of ideas to work with, both to protect ourselves, but also to maybe check our own behavior and certainly sometimes check our colleagues' behavior. So thank you.
Thank you. Always happy to share. So I really appreciate being given this opportunity.
All right, I'll turn the record off. So in case anyone wants to stay after and chat with Caitlin, they can do that. Thanks, everyone.